As a new tenant, when does your rent start running? Is it the day you pay for the apartment, or the day you were given possession of the apartment, or the day the agreement between you and the landlord stated that the rent will start running? Welcome to Law Synopsis. In this episode, we're going to discuss the day the rent of a new tenant starts running. First, if there's an agreement between the landlord and the tenant as to when the rent will take effect, then that agreement is binding between the landlord and the tenant. However, if the landlord takes any action that prevents the tenant from taking possession of a property, then the rent will not start reading from the day both the landlord and the tenant agree that the rent will start running. For instance, the landlord and the tenant agree that the rent will start running from January 1st, and the landlord refused to hand over the keys to that apartment to the tenant until March. Even if the landlord and the tenant agreed that the rent would have started reading from January, because the keys to that apartment was handed over to the tenant in March, the rent will start reading in March. So as a landlord, if you have any agreement with the tenant as to when the rent will start reading, do all within your powers to make sure that you grant the tenant possession and access to that property. In the absence of any agreement between the landlord and the tenant as to when the rent will take effect, the rent will start running from the day that the landlord hands over keys to that premises to the tenant. So as a new tenant, if your landlord gives you the key to that apartment in January and you choose to move in March, the rent will start running from the day that the landlord hands over the keys to that premises to you. Now, let me also state that as a tenant, your rent does not necessarily start reading from the day that you make payments. Like I've said, it will depend on the agreement between the landlord and the tenant, or the day that the landlord hands over keys to that apartment to the tenant. To determine when the rent of a new tenant takes effect is to look at the agreement between the landlord and the tenant. But in the absence of any agreement between the landlord and the tenant, then it will be the day that the landlord hands over keys to that apartment to the new tenant. The day the rent of a new tenant starts running is very important because it will now determine when next that particular tenant will renew his rent. I hope you find this insightful and helpful. Keep watching Law Synopsis. I will see you in the next episode.